In the name of Allah, who came in the person of Master Fard Muhammad, to whom all holy praises are forever due, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that the most honorable Elijah Muhammad is his living and exalted Christ. I further bear witness that the Honorable Brother Minister Louis Farrakhan is their divine reminder, the messenger of God in our midst today. In their names, family, I greet you with the nation's greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, all friends and visitors, for tuning in this evening for our live broadcast of our discussion entitled Master Fard Muhammad and the Deconstruction of the Paul Guthrie Deception. If you have tuned into this, you probably are already aware of the general contours of the discussion. Mr. Paul Guthrie is the author of a particular narrative, we might say, is the author of a particular reading of the Supreme Wisdom. The Supreme Wisdom is the body of teachings, what I describe as not religious doctrine, but a verifiable body of knowledge, but the body of teachings given by Master Fard Muhammad to his students, the supreme of which was and is the most honorable Elijah Muhammad. Mr. Guthrie has advanced a particular reading of Supreme Wisdom that is in diametric contrast to the reading given to us by the most honorable Elijah Muhammad himself. That is to say, Mr. Guthrie presents himself as a better reader of the teachings given by Master Fard Muhammad than was or is even the most honorable Elijah Muhammad. Mr. Guthrie takes issue with the most honorable Elijah Muhammad's elaboration, exposition of the teachings of his teacher, Master Fard Muhammad. And the narrative that Mr. Paul Guthrie is the architect of, we will be deconstructing that narrative this evening, God willing. Now, many have asked, why, Brother Wesley, give Mr. Paul Guthrie any attention at all? What is it about Mr. Guthrie's presentation that you seem to find so harmful? What is it about Mr. Guthrie's presentation that warrants the attention that you are giving it? These are good questions. Mr. Guthrie came to my attention years ago because he wrote what most Muslims in the Nation of Islam who are familiar with this book would deem one of the great books in the defense of the Islam of the most honorable Elijah Muhammad. The book, Making of the White Man, History, Tradition, and the Teachings of Elijah Muhammad by Paul Guthrie. I was a young Muslim when I encountered that work, and that work helped me overcome a stumbling block in my path of understanding the teachings, that being the history of Yaqub and the making of the devil, the making of the white man. I believe that many Muslims know of this work by Mr. Guthrie years ago, and many Muslims, including myself, had and have a great appreciation for the work. That being the case, the author of such work that many Muslims have found to be very important in their development as Muslims, their grasping of a particular aspect of the teachings of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, having the author of such work in later years turn around and advance a narrative which puts the Honorable Elijah Muhammad as one who deceived or was deceived, a narrative in which Master Fard Muhammad is a liar. The Muslims who were positively influenced by Mr. Guthrie's earlier work, Making of the White Man, are vulnerable to being harmed by Mr. Guthrie's more recent work that presents Master Fard Muhammad and the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad and or as deceivers or deceived. So it is important that we deconstruct the narrative of Mr. Paul Guthrie, the most recent narrative of Mr. Paul Guthrie also. This particular narrative of Mr. Paul Guthrie, which has Master Fard Muhammad as a deceiver. This narrative is latched onto by a great many circles of the Black community, in particular, circles that already have a problem with Master Fard Muhammad and the Nation of Islam and the Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan. In many of those particular circles, those hostile circles, Mr. Guthrie's narrative is championed as the antidote to the Islam, to the teachings of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So it, in my view, warrants attention. It warrants scrutinizing, because the same one who is the author of the narrative in which Master Fard Muhammad is not a Arabian Muslim, but in fact was an Indian Buddhist masquerading as an Arabian Muslim, because this narrative is woven by the author of this good book, Making of the White Man, a book which showed skill and intellect. This new narrative was woven together with skill and intellect, and I might add, a touch of technology. This new narrative is found impressive by many. And so we cannot overlook it. So it warrants our attention. One might ask, why the term deception? Why the Paul Guthrie deception? If we disagree with Mr. Guthrie's presentation, why can't it just simply be that Mr. Guthrie was wrong, sincerely wrong? Why must the insinuation or the accusation of willful deception be employed? It is because I believe there is willful deception involved here. Why do I say that? It was in 2013 when I first had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Paul Guthrie on the telephone. We had a long and fruitful, very fruitful telephone discussion. Early in that conversation between myself and Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Guthrie admitted that it is not his claim that Master Fard Muhammad is born in India. The language Mr. Guthrie always uses is Master Fard Muhammad, or in his language is W.D. Farad, came from India. Now, everybody, upon hearing Mr. Guthrie's presentations, including myself, took that to mean that Mr. Guthrie is claiming that Master Fard Muhammad was born in India and was not born in Arabia. His language, his presentation certainly gives that view. But during the course of our telephone conversation in 2013, when I said as much to Mr. Guthrie confessed, he corrected me, in fact, that no, it is not his claim that Master Fard Muhammad was born in India. It is only his claim that Master Fard Muhammad came to America from India, having spent time in India. I asked Mr. Guthrie, being that you know that people are hearing you or reading into what we are hearing from you, reading into that you are saying Master Fard Muhammad was born in India. Since you are not saying that, but your language implies that, why don't you disabuse your viewers and listeners of that false implication, that false reading of your words? Mr. Guthrie has never, since, as far as I'm aware, from that day to this, he has never changed his language. He has never qualified his language. He has never made clear that, in fact, he is not attempting to demonstrate that Master Fard Muhammad was born in India, yet he crafts a case that gives every indication that Mr. Guthrie wants us to believe that Master Fard Muhammad was an Indian, not an Arabian, was a Buddhist, not a Muslim, that he was born in India rather than born in Arabia. Being that, according to Mr. Guthrie's own admission, this is not his claim. And I raised the contradiction to him. yet he has not amended his language. He has not qualified his language. He has not, even when I made public in 2014, his private confession, admission. I made public his private admission, and he publicly did not deny it. He did not say I was a liar, because he knows that I am not. Yet, an important question is, who's lying? Somebody is lying here. He claims Master Fard Muhammad is lying. We're going to show that. He claims Master Fard Muhammad is lying. He created a narrative in which he knows people hear what he is not saying. Yet he will not disabuse his listeners of that false hearing. That, by my definition, is deception. So, it is our position that Mr. Guthrie's presentation is a mix of some great insights, in fact, but also some errors that may very well have been sincere and innocent, but also some willful deception in what we call in the Nation of Islam tricknology. We hope to, in this discussion, demonstrate the deception, the errors, and even highlight some of the insights, all en route to deconstructing the Paul Guthrie deception. It is our position that Paul Guthrie's video series entitled Get on Board the Wheel, in which he seeks to convince us that Master Fard Muhammad was not an Arabian Muslim, but instead an Indian Buddhist, is not to be taken too seriously at all. While there are some redeeming qualities of Mr. Guthrie's presentation, his main claims are based on a lack of knowledge of Islam as a historical tradition, a shallow understanding of Buddhism, and a demonstrable misrepresentation of the supreme wisdom of the Nation of Islam. Mr. Guthrie's scholarly methods are at times so amateurish and illogical that he seems at times to be willfully deceptive, knowing non-nuanced thinkers and observers won't catch it. The net effect is this: Mr. Guthrie is totally disqualified to speak on the subjects he presumes to be an authority of. In these presentations, Mr. Guthrie sounds very good and persuasive on a casual listening. However, when his words, arguments, methods, and evidences, to the extent that he actually provides any evidence, when they are actually scrutinized by critical viewers, Mr. Guthrie's construction proves to be nothing more than an impressive house of cards easily blown down by the winds of critical engagement, which we will do here this evening, inshallah. Mr. Guthrie makes a number of what we might call macro claims and quite a few micro claims. We cannot, though, over the course of our many contributions to this discussion or discourse, we have dealt with a number of Mr. Guthrie's micro claims. Our focus this evening will be on Mr. Guthrie's main macro claims, his two main claims. Mr. Guthrie's two main claims are: one, Master Fard Muhammad came from India and not Mecca, Arabia. Mr. Guthrie, in relation to this claim, claims also that the root of civilization, according to Master Fard Muhammad, is in the Indus Valley, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, and not the area now called Mecca, Arabia. Now, this is important. Mr. Guthrie does not actually make the case that the Indus Valley is the actual root of civilization. From an historical, archaeological perspective, Mr. Guthrie acknowledges the Indus Valley civilization being contemporary with such civilizations as that of ancient Egypt. So it's curious that Mr. Guthrie does not advance the historical argument that the Indus Valley is the root of civilization. Mr. Guthrie specifically claims that Master Fard Muhammad claims in his lessons that the Indus Valley is the root of civilization. In other words, Mr. Guthrie does not present history as his argument that the Indus Valley civilization is the root of civilization. I have never heard him advance such an argument. What Mr. Guthrie claims is that in this book, the Book of Supreme Wisdom, authored by Master Fard Muhammad and the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that in this book, the root of civilization here described is talking about India. So he says, Mr. Guthrie, that India is the only root of civilization he, W.D. Farad, ever identifies. Now, this is important. This is an important nuance that Mr. Guthrie is claiming that Master Fard Muhammad himself is identifying in his lessons the Indus Valley civilization as the root of civilization. Main claim number two, that Master Fard Muhammad taught Buddhism. He did not teach Islam. Connected to that main claim is the claim that the supreme wisdom teachings of Master Fard Muhammad are alien and incompatible with Islam, but totally compatible with Buddhism. So, in sum, Mr. Guthrie's claim is that, contrary to what the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, Master Fard Muhammad was not an Arabian Muslim. Master Fard Muhammad was an Indian Buddhist masquerading as an Arabian Muslim. Now, these two main claims of Mr. Guthrie rest on what I am calling the 5 pillars of the Paul Guthrie deception. The 5 pillars of the Paul Guthrie deception. It is our objective this evening to dismantle and deconstruct the Paul Guthrie deception by crumbling each of the 5 pillars upon which this deception stands. The 5 pillars of the Paul Guthrie deception are: 1, pillar number 1, The 2,200-mile walk points to the Indus Valley only. I will name these pillars, but over the course of our discussion, each one will be unpacked. Pillar number 2, the 9,000 nautical miles point to the Indus Valley only. Pillar number 3, the Mecca of the supreme wisdom was the Indus Valley only. Pillar number 4, Master Farad Muhammad never mentioned Allah or the Prophet Muhammad. Pillar number 5, Master Farad Muhammad wrote in the Indian Urdu language, not the Arabic language. These are the 5 pillars upon which the Paul Guthrie deception rests. We intend to meticulously deconstruct each one. And I emphasize meticulously for this reason. Part of Mr. Guthrie's success has been, rather than producing sourced literature, scholarship, showing the sources of his claims, his many claims, which allows the community of scholars to interrogate and vet. Instead, Mr. Guthrie produces videos, good-looking videos. But in the videos, Mr. Guthrie throws out claims and then moves on. But the claim is impressive to a viewer. But Mr. Guthrie provides no sources for most of his claims. He creates an impressive house of cards. But on closer examination, we see that it is foundationless. If we are going to deconstruct the Paul Guthrie deception, we will be meticulous. We will not match his abbreviated presentation. We will see him, his theatrics, and raise him critical scholarly engagement. So we will spend time. We will lift up meticulously details, mathematical details, historical details, linguistic details, because all of these matters bear on Mr. Guthrie's narrative, yet Mr. Guthrie himself never relied on such details. He never relied on true mathematical details. He never relied on true historical details. He never relied on actual linguistic details. So we will lift these details up as we meticulously dismantle and deconstruct the Paul Guthrie deception. Now, again, somebody's lying. We will let Mr. Guthrie tell us who he thinks is lying and why.
If W.D. Farad came from India, why would he allow people to think he came from Arabia?
Because that perception was necessary. Now, think about the public opinion, the public view as it regarded nationality in America between 1910 and 1934. In 1910, at the same time that he is said to have begun coming, or first started coming in and out of this country. In 1910, there was a huge migration of Indians from India into California. And it was at that time that California passed the Indian Exclusion Act. It was designed to keep Indians out of the country. If he had advertised the fact that he was from India, he would have been subject to immediate deportation. He would have been sent out of the country. Indians were very much hated in America during that time, at that period of time, and even up until World War II. Indians were considered part of the Yellow Peril, the Asiatic threat, as the newspapers of that time referred to it. If you look at the sources, old sources, newspapers, they're all talking about how can we get rid of these Indians. Now, at the same time, people from Arabia were welcomed with open arms in this country. Americans saw Arabians as allies.
Well, there you have it. Master Fard Muhammad deceptively presented himself as an Arabian when in fact he was an Indian, and this deception was necessitated by what Mr. Guthrie claims is a socio-political environment in America at that time between 1910 and 1930, in which Indians, a socio-political environment hostile to Indians but friendly to Arabians, a socio-political environment and immigration environment in which Indians were excluded and Arabians were welcome. This environment, according to Mr. Guthrie, necessitated Master Fard Muhammad lying about his true nationality in order to not be exported as Indians would be. He falsely claimed to be an Arabian who were allies here in America, allies to white Americans, and therefore were on strong, secure, and safe footing here in America. Well, Mr. Guthrie is right about the disfavor that Indian nationals faced during that time period. Between 1903 and 1908, approximately 6,000 Punjabis, persons from Punjab, Pakistan, which at one time was a part of India, approximately 6,000 entered North America, including Canada, 3,000 of them continuing to the U.S. By 1910 in California, there were over 6,000 Punjabis. They faced discrimination and expulsion out of Oregon and Northern California. This is true. White Americans sought and lobbied for the imposition of restrictions. This is true. But this is where this is where the truth stops with Mr. Guthrie's presentation. Because Arabians, the immigration climate at that time was equally hostile to Arabians. It was as seen, for example, most importantly, in the Immigration Act of 1917, otherwise known as the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. What is the Asiatic Barred Zone Act? Well, it is the update. It was an update to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. This act denied Chinese immigrants entry into the U.S. The Immigration Act of 1917 updated this Chinese Expulsion Act to include new designated areas and peoples of exclusion, no longer limited to Chinese persons. The new specific regions whose native peoples were being barred now included Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the Pacific Islands. We read, the Immigration Act of 1917, the law created an Asiatic barred zone provision prohibiting immigration from British India, most of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and the Middle East. In practice, we read, in practice, the barred zone provision excluded immigrants from Afghanistan, the Arabian Peninsula, Asiatic Russia, India, Malaysia, Myanmar, and the Polynesian Islands. Arabs, Arabians, Middle Easterners in general were excluded by the Asiatic barred zone. They were not allies. They were not treated as allies, as Mr. Guthrie claims. The Arabians and the Indians were excluded by the 1917 Immigration Act. In 1924, a new Immigration Act, the Johnson-Reed Act or National Origins Act, quote, severely restricted the immigration of Africans and outright banned immigration from Arabia and Asia. The claim that Master Fard Muhammad had to conceal his actual Indian nationality by masquerading as an Arabian national because immigration policy was anti-Indian and pro-Arabian is absolutely false. And so the reason that Mr. Guthrie attributes to Master Fard Muhammad's deception did not exist. Immigration policy during that time was exclusatory to Arabians and it was exclusatory to Indians. So there is no reason, no socio-political context which Mr. Guthrie can lean on to justify his claim that Master Fard Muhammad was deceptive in Detroit. So when we ask, who's doing the lying, because understand, according to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, his teacher, Master Fard Muhammad, gave him the details of his birth, details of, at least some of the details of his coming of age, gave him some details of his growing into maturity and traveling the world, some details of his preparation for his mission to come here to America. Now, that preparation did include traveling the world and studying the educational systems of the world, including in India, which is why I personally have no problem with the language. Master Fard Muhammad came from India. Between 1910 and 1930, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad tells us Master Fard Muhammad was in and out of this country multiple times. It is not inconceivable to me that one or more of those trips in and out of America involved his coming to America from India or Pakistan. We know, according to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that he spent time in India. He spent time in Pakistan. If his time spent there is noticeable in what he shared with us, that would only be natural, and that would be a perfectly fine cosmetic matter. But Mr. Guthrie, while he never states, and he refuses to state, that Master Fard Muhammad was born in India, he allows his material to be taken as such. That would make the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad a liar, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, or, of course, it would make Master Fard Muhammad a liar, who not only for the purposes of a false immigration context, it did not exist then, the context that Mr. Guthrie is trying to sell. A context, an immigration context that was anti-Indian, pro-Arabian, that did not exist during that time. But even beyond the idea, the suggestion that in order to avoid any immigration trap, Master Fard Muhammad disguised an Indian nationality with an Arabian nationality. Yet that would not account for the details of birth and growth that Master Fard Muhammad gave to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He told us about his birth there in Mecca. He told us some of the things he encountered growing up. So this would make Master Fard Muhammad or the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, it would make Master Fard Muhammad an outright liar. Or it makes the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad a liar on Master Fard Muhammad. I am suggesting, dear family, that because somebody has to be a liar here, the evidence is clear and overwhelming. Master Fard Muhammad did not lie. The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad did not lie, but we will show that if any deception is afoot here, Mr. Guthrie is guilty of it. Pillar number one, the 2,200-mile deception.
So that's talking about the historical evidence. Is there any other evidence inside of the lessons themselves besides this saying it's located in the Far East and it's bordered by the Indian Ocean on the south, which indicate that the root of civilization is in India?
Yes, in lesson number 1, question 4, answer 4 rather, it says that the distance between the root of civilization and the Caucasus Mountains equals a distance of 2,200 miles, where it says that they walked from the root of civilization up to the hills and caves. Mecca, Arabia, is less than 1,500 miles from the Caucasus. So again, according to the lessons, as it is described, Saudi Arabia, Mecca, and Saudi Arabia is excluded. It's less than 1,500 miles away. But the distance between the Indus Valley Civilization of India and the Caucasus Mountains equals 2,200 miles, the exact distance described in the lessons. W.D. Farad tells us how to measure the route and the history of General Mukmuk.
Okay, General Mukmuk. A lot of people don't know anything about General Mukmuk. And for those who don't know, can you talk about that?
Okay, and it's true that many of the students or those who study what he wrote, they've never even heard of General Mukmuk. Nowadays, it used to be very well known up until the 1970s. Then it became very. Now no one knows about it. W.D. Farad said that when those who were expelled from the root of civilization were driven into the hills of West Asia, the person in charge, or the man in charge of their expulsion, was General Mukmuk. He said that General Mukmuk first drove the troublemakers westward before heading northward. He said it was 2,200 miles and they walked every step of the way. You can see that in Lesson 1, Question 4, like I said. He further said that at the halfway point between the root of civilization and the hills, at a distance of 1,100 miles, General Mukmuk let them stop and rest at an oasis. An oasis is a fertile or green spot in the midst of a desert or a wasteland. The first thing to point out is that according to the history of General Mukmuk, as it's been taught, the root of civilization from which they were driven, again, cannot be Mecca, Arabia, because Mecca, Arabia is located right up near to the western shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula. It's up on the sea. The Red Sea is right there. So traveling westward from Arabia, they would have had to have crossed water. They would have had to go across water. And if they crossed water, it meant they either swam or they used boats. But the lessons say they walked every step of the way. So unless someone claims that they walked on water, then the route they traveled could not have been from Mecca, Arabia. Starting from India, however, and traveling from the Indus Valley region up to the Caucasus, they absolutely would have to begin by traveling westward. And the route from India fits that perfectly. Even the oasis, which W.D. Farad describes as being 1,100 miles away, starting in India, traveling westward, just like he said, then bearing northwestward, traveling halfway, 1,100 miles, there's all this harsh terrain. It's a desert, just as it's described. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, in the middle of all of this desolation, we see the oasis. It's striking, it's clear, it's unmistakable, and it can be proven in no limit of time. And when we measure the distance from the Indus Valley up to that oasis, which we can still see there today, it's very large, we find that it's 1,100 miles, exactly half of the 2,200 mile distance, exactly as W.D. Farad describes it. The fact demonstrates that the route measured from the root of civilization, which is in the Far East, which is bordered by the Indian Ocean on the south, and which is 2,200 miles away from the Caucasus, and which has a oasis, and the oasis is located at the halfway point of 1,100 miles, accurately describes nowhere else on the face of the planet except India.
Accurately describes nowhere else on the face of the planet except India. Wow. Now, in order to really understand and appreciate Mr. Guthrie's claims and to understand and appreciate our deconstruction of Mr. Guthrie's claims. Need to have some context, understand what we're talking about here. What is this 2,200 miles and General Monk and what's really going on? The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that after the Caucasian people or devils were created on the island of Pilar in the Mediterranean Sea or Aegean Sea, they were allowed back into, or they were allowed into the holy land of Arabia. The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that having been in Arabia for only 6 months, they started making mischief, lying, stealing, and causing disputes among the righteous people. After 6 months, it was determined that the cause of the new strife was this new people, the Caucasian people. So they were rounded up by order of the king. The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us the whites that had entered Arabia were rounded up, all that we could find, some were hidden. But those who were rounded up, those who were located, were rounded up, stripped of everything that we had given them as the kind host that we were, stripped of everything that we had given them except the language. And they were kicked out of Arabia, kicked out of the holy city, Mecca. They were forced, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, to walk to their new place of imprisonment or new place of exile. That new place of exile would be the Caucasus Mountains in Europe. The penalty for their mischief making in the Holy Land was that they were to walk to their new place of exile. The path on foot to the Caucasus Mountains was over the hot Arabian desert. We are told that they were to walk every step of the way, and the distance that they walked, according to the lessons, the distance that they walked between Mecca, Arabia, and the Caucasus Mountains was 2,200 miles by foot. And this journey took them over the hot Arabian desert. Now, Mr. Guthrie traces a particular route. Mr. Guthrie disputes this. Mr. Guthrie claims that the beginning of the journey of the devils from the root of civilization into their new place of exile, the Caucasus Mountains. Mr. Guthrie disputes that the originating location was in Mecca, Arabia. Mr. Guthrie claims that the lessons are really talking about the Indus Valley as the root of civilization from which the devils were driven into the caves and hillsides, the Caucasus Mountains of Europe. Mr. Guthrie bases his claim. He says that Mecca, even though the lessons say Mecca, Arabia, Mr. Guthrie claims that certainly it can't mean Mecca, Arabia, because, he says in the clip, Mecca is less than 1,500 miles away. But we're looking for 2,200 miles. Mr. Guthrie says Mecca, Arabia is less than 1,500 miles away. But please note, no data was presented at all. That was a claim thrown out there. no basis of this calculation that Mecca was less than 1,500 miles from the Caucasus Mountain. No basis was ever offered. No mathematics was ever offered. He gives us nothing to gauge how he came up with this figure that Mecca was less than 1,500 miles away from the Caucasus Mountains, and therefore could not be the starting point of this 2,200-mile journey. Rather, Mr. Guthrie traces a particular route. He claims that the real starting place is the Indus Valley, and he traces a particular route from his putative Indian route of civilization up into the Caucasus Mountains, a route which he claims equals the 2,200 miles of which the Supreme Wisdom speaks. However, Mr. Guthrie never shows us the geographical calculations that gives us 2,200 miles from his preferred point of departure in India to the Caucasus Mountains. And there is very good reason for Mr. Guthrie's refusal to show us his calculations. It is because the math does not work. Now, he mentions General Monk, a lesson called General Monk. And we have that lesson. Mr. Guthrie hinges everything, it appears, certainly this particular pillar, which we call the 22-mile pillar. This pillar is anchored in this lesson, General Monk. Or should I say, it's anchored in a blatant misrepresentation and misuse of this lesson, General Monk. Now, as a young 5%er in my day, early in my journey, I encountered this lesson, General Monk. It was then and is now, it was a favorite among the 5%ers. I don't know, to be frank, I don't know its popularity among those of us in the mosque. I know it was very popular among the 5%ers. Mr. Guthrie hinges his 22-mile argument on this lesson that the provenance of which has not been confirmed. But I like the lesson. I personally, frankly, don't see anything in the lesson that is in contradiction to what the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us on the matter. And in fact, the lesson itself claims to derive directly from the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So, okay, I am not at all opposed to the lesson. It only introduces certain details that are not in Message to the Black Man. Those details, one of which is what Mr. Guthrie highlights and hinges his whole argument on. But he does so by totally misrepresenting General Monk. So let's introduce General Monk to the listening audience. So, according to the lesson, General Monk, when the king ordered the rounding up of the Caucasians and the devils to be exiled, to be marched over the hot Arabian desert into their new land of exile, the Caucasus Mountains. He put in charge of that detail a particular commander or general, General Monk. He, General Monk, commanded the Arabian troops that were responsible for leading the devils out of Arabia. It said in General Monk that the troops who were responsible for leading the devils out of Arabia were in fact those Arabians who had fallen victim to the devil's mischief making. As a penalty for their fallen victim to the devil's mischief making, they had to be among the troops leading the devils out of Arabia, and they had to stay as sentinels, as guards out of Arabia, making sure that the devils don't enter back into the Holy Land. It was General Monk, the lesson describes, who led this troop of Arabians that marched the devils out. Now, according to General Monk, and the lesson specifically says, see, this is the deception. The General Monk lesson places the origin of the journey, not in India. It places it specifically in Mecca, Arabia. We'll get to that. According to General Monk, the lesson, which is a plus lesson, I have to make that point. It is not in the Book of Supreme Wisdom. In the 5%, we call this a plus lesson outside the general group of lessons. But I digress. According to General Monk, as he led the troops and the devils they were escorting across the hot Arabian sands, they came to a midpoint in which there was an oasis. According to the lesson, the devils who walked every step of the way, if any of the devils will fall down tired, General Monk gave the order, off with his head. General Monk carried a rifle. The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, or the lesson tells us, while the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad says in Message to the Black Man that some of the troops carried rifles and some of the troops carried swords. According to the General Monk lesson, when the devil would get tired and fall to his knees for a rest, General Monk would give the order, off with his head. And so you will find some white skulls buried under the sands of ancient Arabia. Their heads were chopped off, those who got tired walking under the hot Arabian sun atop the hot Arabian desert. But from Mecca to the midpoint where there was an oasis in the desert, 1,100 miles, midpoint of the journey. It was during their time at the oasis. Everyone was allowed to rest. The devils were allowed to rest. They were allowed to eat some food. And then they would begin the second leg of the journey, which too which too was 1,100 miles from the oasis to the point of ultimate destination, the Caucasus Mountains. So the general monk degree or plus lesson describes a journey that begins according to the lesson that Mr. Guthrie hinges so much upon. A journey that began in Mecca, Arabia, and has Arabian Muslims escorting the devils out of the holy city across the hot Arabian desert, stopping at an oasis in the desert, which was 1,100 miles from Mecca, exactly midpoint to the ultimate destination, after spending some time refreshing at the oasis. General Monk and the troops got the devils back on track, headed to their place of exile in the Caucasus Mountains, which was another 1,100 miles, making a total journey 2,200 miles or 2,200 miles. This is the history as presented in the General Monk lesson. I like the lesson. I don't find anything objectionable about it. What I do find objectionable is the misuse and misrepresentation that Mr. Guthrie uses it for, because it clearly identifies the place of origin as Mecca, Arabia. It clearly identifies the desert that was traversed during the journey, the Arabian desert. Mr. Guthrie expunges these parts of the lessons to make mischief with certain details of the lessons, but I will give Mr. Guthrie this credit. His emphasis of this oasis was a great point, in fact. And I don't know others who have emphasized the oasis. Mr. Guthrie treats the oasis in this lesson as the key to unraveling the location of the root of civilization. And I must say I agree with Mr. Guthrie on that point, that identifying the oasis, locating the oasis mentioned in the lesson of General Monk is a key to identifying, to confirming exactly where the root of civilization is. So for that, that emphasis, I applaud Mr. Guthrie. But Mr. Guthrie got it wrong. Mr. Guthrie misrepresented the lesson to advance his proposal, but Mr. Guthrie was wrong in his proposal, as we will document mathematically. Now, what's important in order to really understand the math, we have to understand something about the Caucasus Mountains. There are actually two Caucasus Mountains ranges, and that is very important because you have to identify the right Caucasus Mountains in order to get the math right. There are two separate and parallel mountain ranges, the Greater Caucasus and the Lesser Caucasus. The Greater Caucasus, also called Cis-Caucasus, is the northern mountain range, and it lies between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and it falls within what's called European Russia. The Greater Caucasus includes southern Russia, the northern part of Georgia, and the northern part of Azerbaijan. Parallel to the Greater Caucasus, or Cis-Caucasus, is the Lesser Caucasus, also called Trans-Caucasus. This southern mountain range is bordered on the north by Russia, bordered on the west by the Black Sea, and the important detail is bordered on the south by Turkey, and bordered on the east by the Caspian Sea and Iran. Armenia, most of Azerbaijan, and most of Georgia are part of the Lesser Caucasus region. This is important. We know and we can confirm that the Caucasus Mountains referred to the place of exile of the Caucasians or the devils was the Lesser Caucasus, the Trans-Caucasus mountain range, not the Greater Caucasus or the Cis-Caucasus mountain range. How can we confirm that? Because the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches that in the 2,200-mile journey, right before encountering the mountains, the Caucasians entered Turkey. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad, what he teaches us, gives us to understand that it was Turkey that was south of the mountains that were the place of exile. And in fact, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, and the plus lesson, General Muntma, gives a little more detail. The Arabian troops that escorted the Caucasians, they were stationed in Turkey to keep the Caucasians from entering back into the Holy Land. So Turkey was the buffer zone between the mountains and the Holy Land. That helps us to easily and clearly identify which Caucasus mountain range we should concern ourselves with. It is the Lesser Caucasus Mountains, the Trans-Caucasus Mountains, a very important detail in order to get the math right. Now, the oasis is the key. Mr. Guthrie makes the oasis the key to his whole narrative. Certainly, his whole understanding of where the 2,200 miles from the root of civilization to the Caucasus Mountains is. And I am inclined to agree with Mr. Guthrie that identifying the oasis is key to understanding the journey. Mr. Guthrie proposes or suggests that he has identified the oasis exactly according to his one graph. That oasis, which is 1,101 miles away from the area in India that he identifies as the starting point. He identifies the area now called Karachi. Even though the main cities of the Indus Valley civilization were Harappa, and Mohenjo-Daro. Harappa today sits in what's now Punjab, Pakistan. And Mohenjo-Daro sits now in what's Sindh, Pakistan. But Mr. Guthrie's, none of his reconstructions start us from the major cities of Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro. That's curious. Well, rather I would say convenient, because you can make any math work starting with Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro, which were the holy cities, if you will, of the Indus Valley civilization. So why you would not start your narrative at the one of the two holy cities, if you will, of the ancient Indus Valley civilization is curious, but not for me. I know why, because no math will work starting from the actual two holy cities. So Mr. Guthrie prefers to start his narrative at Karachi. And from Karachi, he has identified an 1,100-mile track to what he is identifying as the oasis mentioned by General Monk. He is identifying Hali. Hali is a village with a protected wetland located in Bandar Ganave, a city within the Bushehr province of southwest Iran. Bushehr is a port city. Now, please forgive your brother, but these details are important. I said a meticulous deconstruction of the Paul Guthrie deception. A meticulous deconstruction is necessary so we leave neither root nor branch. There should be no ambiguity regarding the foundationlessness of Mr. Guthrie's narrative. So bear with your brother. And I say, as I always say, it is not the devil that is in the details. It is God that's in the details. And it's truth that resides in nuance. Satan makes mischief by omitting details. Say that again. Satan makes mischief by omitting details. God knocks out the brains of falsehood with truth, because that truth is packed with the details that Satan has omitted and wanted not part of the narrative. So we are not going to be Satan tonight. We are going to be God. So we are going to live with details. We are going to shine light on the nuance. And then, and only then, will it be clear who is the liar and who is the Savior, Master Fard Muhammad. So, Mr. Guthrie identifies this village with a protected wetland, Hali, in the southwestern part of Iran. This village is located in the Bushehr province. Very important. Now, it's important to look at the particular route that Mr. Guthrie traces. This is Mr. Guthrie's proposal of the journey that took place 6,000 years ago. That it took this route, this particular route, from Karachi to Hali in Iran. Now, there are multiple problems with this proposal, and these problems are fatal. The problems aren't incidental. The problems aren't cosmetic. The problems with Mr. Guthrie's proposal are fatal, as we shall see. First, take a look at square number 2. Square number 1 is Mr. Guthrie's proposed route from Karachi to Hali, Iran. Square number 2 is a close-up of the Bushehr province, where sits Hali, the proposed oasis in the desert of Mr. Guthrie. In box number 2, in the upper right-hand corner, you see that the Bushehr province is not in the desert. The Bushehr province in which sits Hali, the Bushehr province, is a port city. Now, there are deserts in India, there are deserts in Pakistan, there are deserts in Iran. But none of these deserts are along the path that Mr. Guthrie charts from the Indus Valley region to his alleged oasis. And what's more, the alleged oasis itself is not in the midst of a desert. Bushehr province is not far from the coastline. It's called City of Sunshine and City of the Sea. And as you can see, Bushehr province is surrounded by greenery. Now, the Hali protected area that Mr. Guthrie proposes as the oasis in the desert, it's not in the desert. It's a national conservation park located only 10 to 35 kilometers northwest of the port of Bushehr. Now, Iran has 2 great deserts. Now, remember, according to General Mutma, the devils walked over a hot desert for 1,100 miles. And at that midpoint, there was an oasis in the midst of a desert. After getting some rest, cooling off, they continued their journey into the caves and hillsides of Europe. So there must be a desert. The oasis must be in the middle of a desert. Hali, Iran, is not in the midst of a desert. It's surrounded by a whole bunch of scenery. It's a greenery. It's 10 to 35 kilometers out from the port into the Arabian Sea. In fact, not only, now look, in the lower left-hand corner, box number 3, that is the exact path that Mr. Guthrie proposes as the path for the journey, 1,100 miles through desert. But you see in box number 3 that that route is not a desert route. It's a very green route. Pakistan has deserts, as you see down in box number 4, but the route charted by or proposed by Mr. Guthrie doesn't take the devils through any of those deserts. So Halley, the oasis proposed by Mr. Guthrie, is in the Bushehr province. In the Bushehr province, not only does it not have a desert, Bushehr province has a beach. Bushehr province does not have a desert. Bushehr province has a beach. Not only Mr. Guthrie's imagined route for the marching devils is along the narrow, Black Facts Matter, because General Montmont describes as very specific with the terrain that the devils had to travel. It was a torturous terrain. That was the whole point. Please, details matter. So the devils were rounded up, and as their punishment, they were forced to walk over the hot Arabian desert. And any that will slow down because their feet were hot, they would get off with their heads. Any that would get tired, or so any weakness as a consequence to this torturous terrain, they would be killed. This was the punishment of the mischief makers. So the arduousness, the tortuousness of the desert terrain is central to the narrative, both as given by the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad and as presented in the General Monk lecture. But lo, the specific route that Mr. Guthrie wants to start and take the devils on, the route that he proposes for their 1,100-mile journey, was not a route along hot desert sands. It was a route almost a whole way along a beach. This area that Mr. Guthrie identifies as the route, that area is the Makran coast of Pakistan. The Makran coast along the Sea of Oman and the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Sea, it stretches from Mr. Guthrie's Karachi to the port city of Bandar Abbas in Iran. The physiography of the Makran coast, the Makran coast is what's down here, the coast between Karachi and the bottom right-hand corner. It's the specific route that Mr. Guthrie traces. It's the route, the coastal route from Karachi to Halley. But this coastal route is called the Makran Coast. It includes a narrow coastal plain that rises rapidly into the Makran coastal range or mountain range, which is in the southwest of Pakistan. Now, this is important. The route, the proposed route, Mr. Guthrie's proposed route, involves a narrow coastal plain, which is a long stretch of beach sand and water. That is not a desert. Sand and water is a beach. And adjacent to that narrow coastline, the Macran coastline, rapidly rising mountains called the Macran Coastal Range. Between the mountain range and the sea is deserts? No, beaches. Beaches. This is the route that Mr. Guthrie is attempting to read into the General Monk lesson. There is no hot burning sands, it's cool beach sands. In terms of, and these are images of the Macron. This is the route. These images here are images from the Macran coastline. This is what the devils and the troops would have traveled along. There is no hot burning sands here that requires rest at an oasis. The whole journey was by the water. The terrain, in terms of the terrain itself, Mr. Guthrie's proposed route is eliminated. On top of that, the math does not add up. If we Google Map Karachi, Mr. Guthrie's, Karachi, Pakistan, Mr. Guthrie's preferred point of departure, if we Google Map Karachi and Haleh, Bushehr province, Google Map gives us a distance on foot of 1,228.5 miles. 1,228.5 miles. We're looking for 1,100 miles. So this Google Maps route of Mr. Guthrie's proposal that the journey went from Karachi, Pakistan to Haleh, Iran, Google Maps gives us a distance that is off by 130 miles by foot. But a wise observer, and hopefully all of you out there listening are wise observers, you might say, well, that is not exactly the route that Mr. Guthrie charted. So the math may be off, and you are right. If you notice on Google Maps doesn't have us, or doesn't have the devils traveling the Macran coast. Rather, Google Maps has the devils going around the Macran mountain range, avoiding the coastline, circling the mountain range. And this may account for the difference in the numbers. Okay. Granted, Google Maps, if we try to get Google Maps to give us the distance from Karachi, Pakistan to Haleh, Iran, traveling along the Macran coast, instead of circling around the Macran mountains, Google will not do that for us. But no need to fear. we were successful in figuring out that mathematics because we want to be true to Mr. Guthrie's proposal. And this particular route is not the route that Mr. Guthrie proposed, so we won't impose this mathematics on his proposal. It was not easy, but we were able to identify the mathematics of specifically Mr. Guthrie's proposal. From Karachi, Pakistan, now, you have to understand these two maps. Mr. Guthrie's proposed route, again, has the devils traveling the Makran coastline. He doesn't have them traveling around the Makran mountains. He has them traveling that narrow coastline strip between the Arabian Sea or Sea of Oman and the Makran mountains. He has them traveling the Makran coastline. The Makran coastline, the two ends of the Makran coastline are the Karachi port city, or in Pakistan, the Karachi port city. And the other end of the Makran coastline is the Bandar Abbas post city in Iran. And then map number 1 on the left side of the screen are the two ends of the Makran coast. Karachi, the port city of Karachi in Pakistan, and the port city of Bandar Abbas in Iran. That gets us only part of the way. That distance now, because that's the Makran coastline that the devils allegedly traveled as part of their journey to Halle. The distance between these two ends of the Makran coastline there are two different numbers given depending on how it's calculated. One number gives 620 miles long. One number gives 880 miles long. Now, one of these numbers is detrimental to the proposal of Mr. Guthrie. One of these numbers are friendly to the proposal of Mr. Guthrie. In the spirit of kindness, the Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan from Allah is encouraging us to practice kindness this season of Christmas. So I'm going to start today. So out of the spirit of kindness, I will use the number more favorable to Mr. Guthrie's proposal. If we use the one figure of 620 miles, the distance of the Makran coastline, this is detrimental to Mr. Guthrie's proposal. That makes the overall distance far less than what Mr. Guthrie is hoping for, far less than the 1,100 miles required to get the midpoint of this 2,200 mile journey. However, in the spirit of kindness, because this is the season to be kind, the most honorable or the Honorable Brother Minister Farrakhan, inspired by Allah, is encouraging us to be kind this Christmas season. So I would start tonight and be kind to Mr. Guthrie and just arbitrarily go with the number that is more friendly to Mr. Guthrie's proposal. That second number, 880 miles between the port city of Karachi in Pakistan and the port city of Bandar Abbas in Iran, the two endpoints of the Makran coast. Now, the Makran coast doesn't take us all the way to Haleh or Hali, Iran, which is the presumed oasis. We can Google map the distance from Bandar Abbas to Hali, Iran. I hope you're following me. When we Google map and it gives us the precise route from Bandar Abbas to Hali, or Hali, Iran, that Mr. Guthrie desires, when we Google map that, we get 267 miles from Bandar Abbas to the non-oasis, Hali, Iran. When we add these two figures up, which gives us the total distance between Karachi and Hali, traveling the coastal route the whole time, we get the number 1,147 miles. That's pretty good, Mr. Guthrie. It's not the 1,101 miles that he presented to us, but in a spirit of kindness, we will let this extra 50 miles, we won't even consider that extra 50 miles. We will say that route, the coastal route between Karachi, Pakistan, and the non-oasis of Mr. Guthrie, we will say it's roughly 1,100 miles, traveling the Makran coastline, which is not a desert, it's a beach. But we will give, in the spirit of kindness, we will give Mr. Guthrie that math, 1,100 miles between his proposed route of civilization in Karachi to his proposed non-oasis in Hali, Iran. Fine. But here is the problem. Did you notice, dear family, those of you who watch not only the clip that we provided, but watch this full series? Mr. Guthrie, while he acknowledges that the 2,200-mile journey is a two-leg journey, the first leg from the root of civilization to the oasis, which has to be 1,100 miles. The second leg from the oasis to the Caucasus Mountains, which has to be 1,100 miles. But did you notice, while Mr. Guthrie was happy to share with us the 1,100 miles of the first leg, there was absolutely no mention of the second leg of the journey. The second leg has to equally be 1,100 miles. Why did not Mr. Guthrie complete the mathematics for us? Why did not Mr. Guthrie complete the journey for us. It is because the math does not work for Mr. Guthrie. As you see here, if we Google map the distance on foot by Halle, Iran to the Caucasus Mountains, which is the exact route that, Mr. Guthrie proposes no route. And this is why the distance between Halle, Iran, the non-oasis oasis, and the Caucasus Mountains is not 1,100 miles, it's 1,500 miles. The math is off by 400 miles. And what that means is this. If we do the math, we're looking for a 2,200 mile journey. If we take Google Maps route, circling the Macron Mountains rather than squeezing into the narrow coastline of the Macron coast. And let's be clear, that very narrow coastline that Mr. Guthrie wants to be the path traveled by a troop of, and listen, a troop of Arabians on horseback and camel. Horseback and camel, leading a increasingly wildly group of Caucasians down that narrow strip of the Macron coast between the sea and the rising mountain range. That is not reasonable. If we were to indulge Mr. Guthrie for the moment and assume that the journey was from Karachi to Halle in Iran, certainly the path would have to be, the more reasonable path would be around the mountain range, not squeezed into that narrow coastline. So Google Maps route is more reasonable, but that route, if we add the 1,229 miles between Karachi and Halle that Google Maps proposes, if we add as a first leg of the journey, if we add that to the 1,501 miles of the second leg of the journey, we're looking for 2,200 miles, but we get 4,000 miles. We get 3,959 miles. But you say, brother Dr. Wesley, you were going to be kind this season. So we're going to dismiss with Google Maps more reasonable route around the Macron Mountains rather than squeezed into the narrow Macron coast. But if you're going to be kind, be consistently kind, Brother Wesley. Use that math. Okay. The 1,100, if we add the 1,147 miles of the Macron coast route, of the first leg, if we add that to the 1,501 miles of the second leg, we still don't get 2,200 miles. We get 2,648 miles. So no matter how you cut it, the path or the route proposed by Mr. Guthrie from Karachi, Pakistan to the non-oasis oasis of Hali, Iran, on into the Caucasus Mountains. We either have 2,650 miles or 4,000 miles. We are either off by 450 miles or we are off by 1,760 miles. However you cut it, the math is fatal to Mr. Guthrie's proposal. There's no way to get 2,200 miles out of this journey, which is why I suspect Mr. Guthrie, while holding up the possible 1,100 miles of his putative first leg of the journey, he makes no mention of any mathematics of the second leg of that journey because it's fatal to his whole narrative. Mr. Guthrie's proposal thus has no geographical or mathematical support. His route from the Indus Valley region to Hali, Iran, and on to the Caucasus is a 4,000-mile journey, or at best a 2,650-mile journey, not a 2,200-mile journey. And it is not a journey over a desert that is characterized by the presence of an oasis at a midpoint. It's a journey along a beach. Mr. Guthrie's Indus Valley hypothesis is officially disproven, and we can leave it behind and move on in terms of the 2,200 miles. Well, what about Mecca, Arabia? On the other hand, if we Google Maps Mecca, Arabia to the Lesser Caucasus Mountains, we're looking for a 2,200-mile journey. Google Maps gives us a 2,131-mile journey. It's off by 69 miles. That's still pretty good. We can round that, 2,100 miles. But you say, Brother Wesley, that route is by car. That is correct. That route is by car. But we can fix that. We're going to show the specific route by foot. And we are starting with the route by car to show that the specific route by foot is more perfect than a route by car. This route by car that Google Maps gives us is 69 miles off. It's not the 450 miles off or 1,760 miles off of Mr. Guthrie's proposal. It's only 69 miles off. That's a good figure. We're looking for 2,200 miles and we get 2,131 miles, but that's route by car. And you all want and we want route by foot. Well, we have the route by foot. But more importantly, I would like to announce that I am quite confident, finally located and identified the actual oasis that served as the exact midway point according to the general monk lesson. The oasis is the ancient Mesopotamian marshes located in the Iraq desert in southern Iraq that are the true oasis in the middle of the desert. And they are exactly midpoint between Mecca, Arabia, and the Caucasus Mountains. They are located where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet. For later purposes, it is important to point out now that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers goes through Iraq, Syria, and its headwaters are in Turkey. The Mesopotamian marshes are a bona fide desert oasis. As you read, Iraq's wetland paradise. It says they are an oasis in the middle of the desert, a biodiverse Garden of Eden. The Mesopotamian marshes are thousands of miles of water, reeds, and islands, called Iraq's wetland paradise. The Iraqi marshlands consist of three separate marshlands. Al-Hamra Marsh, the Central Marsh, and this is the brown area on the map, is the marshes. The Al-Hamra Marsh, the Central Marsh, and the Hawize Marsh. It is the Al-Hamra Marsh, which is the largest oasis in all of Western Asia. And a very important detail, it is this marsh in the middle of the desert. The Al-Hamra Marsh is bordered on the south by the Arabian desert in particular. Here is the Al-Hamra Marsh oasis. This is the Mesopotamian marshes in the middle of desert. The Al-Hamra Marsh is contiguous to the Arabian desert. And so traveling the hot burning sands from Mecca, you will run right into this oasis in the middle of the desert. And this agrees with the very lesson that Mr. Guthrie makes his whole case on. Because the lesson, the general monk lesson says specifically, an order was set down for them to be driven across the hot Arabian desert out of Asia. If you're going to rely on the lesson, Mr. Guthrie, quote the lesson right. The oasis, according to the lesson, is contiguous to the Arabian desert, and it is specifically the Al-Hamra Marsh that is contiguous with the Arabian desert. So we have potentially found the oasis in the middle of the desert. The Mesopotamian marshes are oasis in the middle of the desert. We want to know, are they our oasis in the middle of the desert? How can we confirm or deny if the Mesopotamian marshes, the Alhama Marsh in particular, which is an oasis contiguous to the Arabian desert, how can we confirm or deny if this is the oasis that we're looking for? Well, the math don't lie. If we Google map Mecca, Arabia to Alhama, Iraq, route by foot, the distance between Mecca, Arabia, and the Alhama oasis by foot is 1,148 miles. Almost the 1,100 miles that we're looking for off only 48 miles. But we can take care of that 48 miles. How so, Brother Wesley? This is potentially the first leg of the journey. It matches all of the qualifications. It's an oasis contiguous to the Arabian desert, as described in the lessons. And the journey from Mecca to Alhama oasis is 1,100 miles. Well, to be exact, 1,148 miles. That's the first leg. What about the second leg? Because we've been here before. We've been here where the first leg of this 2,200 mile journey that we are looking for, the first leg matched up quite nicely. 1,100 and some odd miles. We got excited. And then the reality of the second leg blew our high. It crushed our spirits. We've been there before, Mr. Guthrie. Is this deja vu? So we should not get too excited yet that the first leg of the journey from Mecca, Arabia to the Alhama oasis, contiguous to the Arabian desert, is 1,100 some odd miles. What about the second leg of the journey? If you Google map the distance from the Alhama oasis to the Lesser Caucasus Mountains by foot, the distance is 1,042 miles, 0.6, or 1,043 miles. Short of the 1,100 miles by 57 miles, but it's a reasonably good estimation. However, when you add the two legs together, when you add the 1,148 miles of the first leg to the 1,043 miles of the second leg, you get almost exactly 2,200 miles. To be exact, we get 2,191 miles. Only 9 miles shy of the sacred 2,200 miles we're looking for. I think, family, we have found the oasis in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the journey that the devils walked from Mecca to the Caucasus Mountains. That oasis is a literal oasis in the desert, contiguous to the Arabian desert as specified in the language, and the math bears it out. Each leg of the journey is roughly 1,100 miles, and together the two legs of the journey gives us the 2,200 miles that we are looking for. And when you compare the We are justified mathematically in rounding up the 2,191 miles. We are justified mathematically in rounding it up to 2,200 miles between Mecca, Arabia, through the oasis of Al-Hama to the Caucasus Mountains. If you compare that to the proposal of Mr. Guthrie, with his rounded up number of 4,000 miles, or in a more kind setting, his rounded up number of 2,650 miles, it is clear the root of civilization from which the devils were exiled into the Caucasus Mountains is in Mecca, Arabia, not Karachi, Pakistan, or the Indus Valley area. The terrain bears this out. The mathematics bears it out. We have found the oasis that General Monk, or the lesson of General Monk describes. It is exactly midpoint between Mecca, Arabia, and the Caucasus Mountains. And it is contiguous to the Arabian desert, a necessary detail according to the General Monk degree or lesson. And I think, family, we have here strong support of our case that we have discovered the midpoint oasis between Mecca, Arabia, and the lesser Caucasus Mountains, into which the devils were run. I believe we have strong support from the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad to our process, or to our proposal. Listen to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He says, this took place, the running of the Caucasian out of the root of civilization. He says, this took place in the 2,000 years before Moses, when God drove the white man out of paradise, or the garden, according to the Bible. It only means the Holy Land of Arabia. Then he says this, very curious, very interesting, very telling. They were in Persia. Persia is Iran. But then he qualifies it. He says they were in Persia, old Persia, over there in the valley of the Euphrates River. When they drove them out, they went across what is now known as Syria, Lebanon, into Turkey, and into the hills and mountains of Europe, end quote. I believe that right here, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad details the route taken by the devils. He said it started, they were driven out of the Holy Land of Arabia. Then he says something curious. They were in Persia, but not just Persia, old Persia. Well, old Persia is very specific. Old Persia is different, it's not Iran. This is a map of old Persia. What's important here for our purposes is that old Persia included Iraq. The area now known as Iraq was a part of Old Persia. And this is why the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad goes on to say they were in the valley of the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River is where we placed the devils, at the Al-Hama Oasis. The Al-Hama Oasis is at the junction of the Euphrates and Tigris River. We placed them there, and here the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad specifically said they were in the valley of the Euphrates, which is in what is now called Iraq. But Iraq was a part of Old Persia. So when he says they were in Persia, Old Persia, we should not think of Iran, we think of Iraq, as he goes on to say they were in the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River in Iraq. And then he says, when they drove them out, they went across what is now known as Syria, Lebanon, and into Turkey, and into the hills and mountains of Europe. This is very important, these details. If you look at the map that we provide of Old Persia, you notice the yellow rectangle highlights the Euphrates Valley. It's in Iraq. The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad said they were driven out and they went across what is now Syria, Lebanon, and into Turkey. So they started in Arabia, were in Iraq, in the Euphrates River area, and then he says they went across Syria, Lebanon, and into Turkey. Syria, if you see on our map, you see within the yellow rectangle is Assyria, because ancient Syria wasn't restricted to the country Assyria that we are aware of today. Ancient Syria included what is referred to in the history books as Assyria. And there it right is on the path headed towards Turkey. And in order to get from the area of the Euphrates River where the oasis is, traveling up, you cross Syria or Assyria and into Turkey, which is south of the Caucasus Mountains. And a clearer map of the route from Arabia to the oasis in Al-Hama, the Al-Hama Oasis in southern Iraq, then in the Euphrates Valley, then up across Syria, and then a right turn into Turkey, into the Caucasus Mountains. This appears to be the precise route that the Caucasians took from Mecca, Arabia, to the Caucasus Mountains. And the critical detail is that this is a 2,200 mile route, almost exactly 2,191 mile route, 1,100 miles from Mecca to the Al-Hama oasis of the desert, 1,100 miles from the oasis in the desert to the mountains, a route that crossed Syria into Turkey and into the mountains, just as the most honorable Elijah Muhammad described. I believe that we have here compelling evidence. Not just that we have found the oasis that serves as the midpoint of the journey of the devils from the root of civilization to their land of exile in the Caucasus Mountains. We found that oasis, the Al-Hama oasis, in the midst of the desert. We have confirmed this detail of the General Monk lesson. And this matches or comports with what the most honorable Elijah Muhammad specifically says in the hints he gives us of the route that was traveled by the devils. So this is strong argument. And with it, we have established as unimpeachable the fact that it was Mecca, Arabia, and not the Indus Valley in India that was the point of origin of this journey by the deserts across, journey by the devils across the desert. Mr. Guthrie's arguments thus tumble like a delicate house of cards, or said differently, the first pillar of the Paul Guthrie deception crumbled.